Superclusters is where we demystify the secrets, stories, and tactics behind the money that moves the venture capital world. Welcome back, Superclusters fans, and today we have a really special episode. And each of our guests today need no introduction, having each been crowd favorites across the Superclusters seasons. And in many ways, this is the college reunion of Superclusters. So today we have Lisa Cawley, Ben Choi, and Jaclyn Freeman Hester. And if you're curious on each of their backstories before they found their way into the world of capital allocation, I would highly recommend tuning into Lisa's episode, Season 3, Episode 5, Ben's episode, Season 1, Episode 6, and Jaclyn's episode, Season 2, Episode 9, which we'll all include in the show notes below. But to give a really short introduction of each, Lisa Cawley is the Managing Director of Screen Door, an LP of GPs. Ben Choi is the Managing Director of Next Legacy Partners, a fund of funds dedicated to harnessing the power of venture capital for positive change. And then we have Jaclyn Freeman Hester, who is a partner at Foundry Group, which invests in both founders and fund managers across North America. So, the elephant in the room, what are we talking about? We are talking about firm building and succession planning. So at what point does a fund become a firm, and what does it mean to actually build a generational firm? What are the intangibles? What are the questions each of them ask to best understand if a GP is thinking long-term? And how do the best firms transition leadership to the next generation of partners? So, to start things off today, I'm curious, is there a job that goes unseen by others, LPs, emerging GPs, established GPs, and or founders, but that you think is most important to building a successful institutional firm?
I think the job and the role that goes unseen by LPs and everybody outside the firm is the role of the culture keeper. I think that the culture keeper, and it can be oftentimes the most impactful is when the culture keeper is somebody in senior leadership, but it doesn't have to be. It can be someone at any level of the firm. And what I mean by every firm has their own culture, right? And but I think one of the keys to an institutional firm that is able to last the test of time is there's a culture that guides the partnership through all those transitions. The transitions are the hard things, and you need something outside of the individual people to help manage those transitions, and culture is what does that. And culture is what helps the full team coordinate and make great investment decisions, all those things. So the culture keeper isn't so much the person who talks about the culture, but does the things that they want to see and embody the culture. So I had a couple of examples that I was thinking of for culture keepers. There's one example I know of from, this is going to date me, but 20 years ago, kind of pre-iPhones, BlackBerries were the thing. And all VCs had BlackBerries. And we were as addicted to screens, our BlackBerries, as teenage girls are to their TikTok, right? And the problem is all we have is email, but gotta check my BlackBerry, gotta check my email, right now, this moment, all the time. And there was a partnership with probably had 10 partners and probably 15 to 20 people investment team in the Monday partner meeting. And BlackBerries were a challenge. They would kind of remind each other, hey, let's not be on devices when we're together. Let's be in discussion. It was a new dynamic. Now we have to deal with it all the time. And there was one time when there was a senior partner who would occasionally stand up, kind of walk to the other side of the room quietly. It was a kind of round circular partnership table, and would just reach over and take somebody's BlackBerry quietly and put it face down on the table and walk back to sit back down. But to me, that was an example of a culture keeper. They're a little bit heavy-handed, literally heavy-handed, but just we're actually going to do the thing we said we're going to do, and we're going to and that was right for them. Other partnerships are different, but the BlackBerry thing was one. One other example. Two of my partners do this. I think when leaders are janitors, that sets a great culture. Well, it's a great message of that particular culture, and that's true of our firm. So two of my partners, if there's trash outside on the sidewalk of our office, if there's trash inside the office, they will always stop. They don't say anything. They don't make a big, hey, look at me, but they will always stop and pick up the trash, wash the dishes that somebody left in the sink, and take the time to put it in the right place. because that is one of our values, our culture is of service. It's also showing, paying attention to the details. Again, just happens to be our culture, but like it's a really, I think, a powerful way to embody that culture. So yeah, culture keeper, I think, is that thing that you don't talk about in the data room, that doesn't show up in DDQs or operational due diligence. But when you think about how do firms manage through all these people in one moment of time or over the course of generations of partners, it's culture that does that.
I have a comment and I have a question, which is, one, I don't know how much this is myth building, and I don't know how much this is still true. But I remember at one point in time, I had come across in reading or in a podcast, I forget what the format was, that Andreessen Horowitz once has had a rule where if for every minute you were late to a meeting, you have to pay $10. I think it was $10.
I can't remember the number. Yeah, there was some dollar amount.
Yeah, and it kept people very honest to show to every meeting, no matter if you're a founder, if you're meeting a founder, or you're meeting a VC, or you're meeting an LP, that you're always there on time.
I believe true. I don't know if it's still true today. The firm is 50 times bigger today than it was in the early days. They're an incredible firm. But yeah, in the early partnership, that was definitely. But that's something actually they talked about. We actually knew that as LPs, so maybe that doesn't go so unseen. It's part of their culture. But yeah, they're very much part of their culture. Being on time to meetings.
I'm curious, speaking of the culture keeper, which I'm going to be completely honest, this is the first time I've even heard this answer of all the different variations I've heard. I've asked the question.
Yeah.
And so this is fascinating to me. So as an LP, how do you go about identifying the culture keeper? And is there something more surgical in which you can do to keep your eyes out for such individuals?
You asked an unfair question, because the question was what goes unseen. And so as LPs, it's unseen, right? We see it inside when we're inside. And so, not every relationship is one where we can see this. It's really a privilege when we get to be close enough to a GP or a partnership where we know about this. And when we know about it, and we can see it in action, it is one of the things that helps us build our conviction around the strength of a partnership. And this is the most, the biggest part of the art of LP investing and asset allocation into a partnership. You can slice and dice all the numbers, you can analyze all the track record, and you can describe each partner's superpowers and all those different things. But how they work together, the culture and values they share, ultimately, we have to have conviction that this partnership will work together in their unique way to make great decisions for today, and they will continue over the course of at least the next 10 years, because the next 10 years is the next 3 or 4 funds, and that's what we're in business with them for, at least that much. And that's the art. That's the art of LP investing.
And it fascinates me to no end. And even like selfishly, I spend a lot of time when I can reading research papers in psychology, just to understand, because they're at the forefront of how people think, how people act, and they've boiled as much of art as it is down to science. Yeah. And so it's always fascinating of of partnerships I've seen work out, do they exhibit behaviors that I've read in a paper, which are always fun.
I need well-read, smart people like you in my life who can read those papers and then tell me about them rather than you reading the papers.
I will say, I'll give a shout out. I don't know him well, although we've emailed and a couple times back and forth, and we've met a couple times, but I don't think he knows me well. But Scott Belsky. The first time I read his book, The Messy Middle, first of all, it's very easy to read because it's formulated in chapters, and each chapter is 2 to 3 pages. It's all you can jump in at any spot in the book, which is the best thing about nonfiction books, and then just learn. And I, silly or not, read it cover to cover the first time I read it. So I didn't go through each individual chapter and just, I like this topic, I'm going to read this topic. But because I went to it cover to cover, I uncovered topic areas that I wasn't necessarily fully excited about. And one of the things, and this is actually where I first learned of this research paper, and then I was like, oh, this is really interesting. There's a lot of parallels here. I went down deeper into. He cited this paper, 1994, George Lowenstein, and the paper is called The Psychology of Curiosity. This guy was a Carnegie Mellon professor, and he said there are 5 triggers to curiosity, right? And it's like, I think it's a 15, 20 page paper. It's not like a long paper, but you can just type it out and it's on like a PDF somewhere, public PDF somewhere.
Yeah.
And that paper effectively says, and I'm going to massively butcher this because I forget all the 5 triggers, but they're like obviously questions and riddles that trigger curiosity. There's access to information known to others, unknown resolutions, and all these kinds of things. And I forget the other 2, which makes me a bad job. Like I'm not translating it well.
You quoted the author, the title, the publisher. You did pretty good.
Okay. But I like that was the one that sent me down this rabbit hole. And then you know how each paper does a bunch of citations? So every time you have very interesting line or sentence, you're like, oh, I now know where to look next for where that rabbit hole might lead me. And so that put me down a long rabbit hole. And I continue to every time the journal of psychology comes out, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to flip through and see if there's anything that's remotely interesting to me.
I'm not well read. I rely on friends who are well read. But have you read Cialdini's Influence?
I have not. To say that I am not well read.
No. It's probably the one psychology book that I've read, and it was 30 years ago in college. But and it to me was really interesting, but just like a book that I read for cognitive psychology class in college, the one class I took. But Charlie Munger cites that book as I think the most influential book in his life, or one of the most. So much so that he quotes it a lot in Charlie's Almanac. Poor Charlie's Almanac.
Yeah.
But he says the book was so influential that he mailed Cialdini, the author, who was a professor, maybe here in the Bay Area, Santa Clara University, I think, maybe.
Okay.
But he mailed Cialdini a share of Berkshire Hathaway stock out of the blue, saying, we don't know each other, but something like this. We don't know each other, but you've been so influential. You've helped make this organization. You should be partaking in the fruits of what we do. Something like that. Something crazy like that.
So, first of all, that's an example of a culture keeper.
Yeah,
right? Going full circle here, that's an example of that.
That's right.
And then the flip side of this, and just to make sure I'm getting the spelling, and I put this all in the show notes later. How do you spell?
Yeah. Yes, Cial, Chow, Cialdini. And I think the book is called Influence. And it's just the study of how we influence each other, how you influence people, and how we are influenced by our biases. And it's like a seminal book on that kind of stuff.
Okay, you've given me weekend reading to do. I'm very much looking forward to it. I have this slot, at least for this weekend, set open for consuming material, because my friend talks a lot about this, and he does a much better job than I do, but he thinks a lot about this thing called information diet and trying not to get info obesity, right? And too much of I don't know, even what I do, I consume is largely venture tech content, and that's a very unbalanced diet, so to speak. And so I've left kind of part of this weekend, 2-3 hours of this weekend, to consume things that are not tech and venture. And so this is a good kind of candidate for that.
You're ahead of me and 99% of the rest of us just having any idea what you're going to do this weekend. That's impressive. I love it.
I don't always... Okay, so before I give the impression that I plan everything out, because first of all, on the Myers-Briggs test, whether you believe it or not, I'm heavily on the P, not the J.
No, no way. Anybody who has any idea what they're doing this weekend is a J.
What are the intangibles that LPs or GPs might often underappreciate when it comes to creating a firm that's destined to go down in history?
I think it really comes back to how you think about actually scaling your teams or not scaling them, and what those kind of internal team pieces are, right? It's what people navigate through when they're in their weekly pipeline meeting or bi-weekly pipeline meeting, how they think about even structuring just the processes behind the scenes. And I think all day long you could put those on flowcharts. I don't know that most managers actually have those, but you can map out what your ideal process is, but it's actually the depth of discussion that I think the internal team has with one another. So said differently, if you're a solo GP and maybe you have a couple supporting, whether on the investment side or the operations side, I think that's what's so important, is that you have to define what your vision for the firm is, years out, in order to make sure that you're setting those people up for success and that they have a runway and a growth path, and that they feel empowered and they feel like they're learning and they're contributing as part of the brand. And so I think so much of what happens there, like, it does tie back to culture and how you treat people, both in terms of helping them make better decisions, helping them discover new things that you otherwise wouldn't. And I'll throw a swimming analogy back to you, since we've talked about this in episodes past, but there's like this amazing, amazing commercial that Michael Phelps did. I think it was like back at the prior Olympics, but the tagline, or the message behind it was, "It's what you do in the dark that puts you in the light." So I think it's all about a lot of those things that happen behind the scenes that, like, even if you're an LP doing diligence on a prospective GP, you can ask them all day long, but until you actually see it in action or you're in that room, there's just not the same magic in terms of telling them how it works.
There may not be an answer to this, so by all means, feel free to push back here. But is there a way where LPs can best expose themselves to what happens in the dark?
I think that comes from having really deep relationships and building those relationships with, whether it's the GP or others on the team. And this is why I think other people on the team that maybe aren't the tip top decision maker, like, having relationships there are really important. I mean, everybody, I've always said this before, everybody has a day one, everybody has a good day, everybody has a bad day. And, there's people that I think have really, really interesting takes and find really interesting people that, again, are not that sole decision maker at the top. And so I think, to me, it always comes back to, one, multiple data points outside of a Zoom screen, outside of a conference room. So, said differently, going to lunch and breakfast and, meeting people like that in settings that have nothing to do with like conducting a transaction. And then the second part of that, I think, is just getting to know the holistic team, right? And seeing how they operate. Like, I always like to look who's talking over one another, like who's answering all the questions, who's, the one, is the one person who they say has the superpower of one topic actually talking about that topic. Are they leaving space for one another to share? Like, I think so much of it does really come back to the culture and what goes on internal for that team. And that oftentimes is the magic.
And to piggyback off of that, one of my favorite people in the venture world is this person that goes by the name of Heidi Roizen, who invests out of Threshold Ventures. And for those unfamiliar with her, I forget if it's Harvard or Stanford, there's a case study on her on how good she is at networking. Like, it's phenomenal. And one of the things she has at her home is this glassblowing studio. And I know, it is fascinating. And she once told me, she was like, you know what? Like, I host all my board meetings at the glassblowing studio. I invite everyone in. Everyone does glass for 2 hours or so before the board meeting. And I was like, why? I mean, awesome. I would love to, glass blow. Don't get me wrong, right? But like, why before board meetings? Why is that important to you? Why is that a crux of it? And what she said is, she wants, like, speaking of things that you do outside of normal meetings and Zooms and all that kind of stuff, she wants to see people check their ego at the door. And so she picked an activity where the average person is probably going to have the same proficiency level, versus if you picked hiking, or if you picked swimming, or you picked pottery. Because it's such a popular activity, people are likely to have different proficiency levels coming in. And if you have someone with a lot of proficiency, they have, like, in their mind, they have to show off a little bit, or they have to at least not look bad, versus the people who aren't as good, they're inherently trying to protect themselves from not looking as bad. And so you have this odd dynamic going on, versus if you pick a sport or a topic or an activity that most people have not tried. And glass is often that for most people. And because of that, the first hour, people are like, oh, I got to make this look good because other people are watching. And that's at the second hour, you're like, oh, forget this. Like, I'm just going to go fully creative and put all the stuff on there. And once you have that attitude, then real conversation can begin. And that's when then you eventually have that board conversation, which I thought was a very interesting point, and I can't help but agree.
I think, it goes back to, you have to get people to take their guard down. so that you can actually have a level of conversation that's actually depth. And otherwise, like if you really think about it, a lot of conversations that you end up having that get scheduled into your calendar to learn about something, like an intro call and things like that, those are all really great starting points. But some of those can even be, I'd argue, shouldn't be phone calls, and you should skip right to, if you find something that's interesting, obviously in the strategy and the depth, like you should skip to a situation where you can have somebody take their guard down. And I think maybe one of the threads that I would pull out from what you said is there's something to be said for putting people in positions where they're either uncomfortable or unfamiliar to see how they react to that. Do they dismiss and don't want to participate? Do they have an interesting level of patience as they try to learn through something and maybe are actually really good at it? And do they have a sense of humor if they are just like flat out terrible at it, no matter how much you actually try to help them? So, I mean, those are all things, right, that speak to somebody's personality. And there's no one right formula there that's like, oh, this is the right level of humor, right? Yeah, everybody has a different personality. And I think that's important to recognize. But there's a lot of value in the like the non-checkbox things. I also talk with a lot of LPs about this philosophy of you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And so something I always like to talk about in some of those like non-transactional settings is like, what are you doing to up your average? Like, how are you trying to better yourself? Because I think, again, it shows self-awareness. It shows a growth mindset. And again, I always go back to the people that are most compelling and interesting to me are people that have this growth and adaptability mindset. Like, you don't know everything. You could have the best plan laid out, and for now through your fund 6 and your fund 20, and that's all well and good, but there's like 0 chance that all of that follows a straight line. So it goes back to like, who do you surround yourself with? What rooms are you trying to get in? How are you learning from those people? And then how are you, again, not becoming them, but taking facets of that to then plug it back into how you think about moving forward and being different. For me, I think firm building is this healthy tension between you're trying to make these what seem like myopic and short-term decisions day to day, week to week, sometimes hour to hour, depending on the situation you're in. But every single one of those has the potential to slightly steer you in a different direction over the long term. And it's really hard when you're in that moment to know how decisions like that will map together to change that path. But then when you look back, it's so obvious and you're like, oh, this is where I went wrong, or this was my inflection point, or this was when the light bulb went off. And so I think it's why venture is so fun. It's why it's so hard. It's why it takes such a long time, and you have to really be committed to it and be committed to learning and competing, right? Because again, at the end of the day, like you have to be in the best and you have to be pushing the bar higher. And you're always trying to think of like making these like fast decisions with extremely long result periods. There's no instant gratification. And if there is, something's probably wrong.
I mean, you can be a firm that goes down in history that had a single fund.
That's true.
Because at the end of the day, this job is creating and maximizing returns for your LPs. That's the job. And of course, there are awesome side effects of coming to the job in a certain way that can benefit the startup communities that you're engaged in, the entire ecosystem of tech and venture and startups, society and the things that you're choosing to back, and in practices around creating more inclusion and bringing more people into entrepreneurship because of just the general benefits of innovation and entrepreneurship on the entire world. So like there's all of those things. But at the end of the day, the job is take a pile of money from your LPs and give them back a bigger pile. And giving back a really big pile can make, like, is the legacy thing, right? Like there are a handful of funds out there that are known for having insane returns. And consistently insane returns is hard. That to me is the firms that go down in history. I'll name USV as one, right? Where, and that's, been made public, like consistently excellent returns and creating alpha for LPs. And so, a lot of that is around building a great culture and set of values and focusing and being disciplined around what it is that we do, where can we be great, and sticking to that. I've talked to you about Founder Collective before. I think that's another firm where they could have raised a ton of money. They could have grown. They could have done opportunity funds, all sorts of things. And they stayed focused on where they think they can excel. And they've been incredibly successful in doing that. And so I think there are different versions around what it means to kind of go down in history or be the best. And everyone has to define that for themselves. And I think what's important is that the firm has alignment around what that means. But at the end of the day, it's a measure on dollars in and dollars out the door. So I think, some of the tangible things, I think it's like staying focused, having alignment, being really communicative, having discipline during hype cycles, and sort of just like deciding what great looks like and going and executing it. And the challenge with adding the firm building and the succession and all of that stuff is it takes time and energy, and can also create just sort of like noise in the system on the human side and drama and things like that, even with best intentions, that can actually take away from performance. And so it's a balance of like, what does it mean to be great? Is it about the best returns possible, even if you only do 3 funds? Or is it about creating something that can last forever? And so I'm not sure that there's a single definition of that.
There's no single definition. I completely agree. Are there examples of definitions you've heard from others that you seem to have gravitated towards?
I don't think I have examples of firms being specific about that, but I do think the firms that stay disciplined around what they are and then are really thoughtful if they're going to change something about what they do, or evolve one of their deeply held beliefs, that they're really thoughtful and aligned around doing that. So, hey, we said that we weren't going to add junior people and grow them up. We only wanted to bring people in laterally. But as we've learned and experienced, and the reality that we are living in is that that's actually harder than we thought it was going to be. So we're going to switch gears on that. We're going to change it. But I think it's around that alignment and also being transparent with your LPs about it. I think that can help a lot, especially if you want your LPs to be comfortable with the evolutions of sort of what you said you were going to do and what you're all about, is kind of bringing them along for the ride and letting them know, hey, this is how we're thinking about it, and giving them a heads up and getting their input. I mean, they see a lot, right? And so, to not forget that the LPs have something to offer as well, and bringing them into those conversations.
And that they're also partners in the partnership. They're, limited partner.
They're limited, but they're partners. Exactly.
Partners.
Maybe it's obvious, but I think it's still underappreciated that ultimately you have to do the work. And I think there are a lot of LPs and also young investors who come into the business who, like, today, there's so much information about venture capital. It's no longer an unknown little small dark corner, smoky rooms where people like power brokers make things happen. Like it's well documented. So I think there are a lot of folks around venture who see the success and believe that you just need to like get lucky. Like, oh, that was random. I just need to be in there and maybe I'll win the lottery too. And I think they really underappreciate how much luck and hard work is involved in building a firm that's destined to go out in history, right? You throw 1,000 VCs into the world, and many of them will be lazy and lucky, but they will not, even those will not build firms that last the test of time. And your question was, it's not just how do you become successful and make money for yourself, but how do you actually build a firm that lasts? In that case, I think you always need luck in venture, but it's those who put themselves in the way of opportunity through hard work and diligence. And you've got to be good. And not everybody in venture is a good investor. We don't know this. We find it out over time, but it's probably useful to find out if you're not good at this at being an investor, and find a way to transition to some other work, right? Or it's important for a firm to realize that you can't just stick anybody into your firm and expect that they're good. You're going to be wrong sometimes. So the firm has to identify real talent and nurture that real talent. You've got to give them lots of opportunity, because even somebody who's good can be unlucky and they're going to fail. As a firm, you need to make sure that you have people who are going to work through that, be consistent in how they're approaching it, have the grit and determination to keep on investing with the same mentality, whether they're super lucky or super unlucky, right? That's what's going to help a firm build a partnership of investors who are going to last the test of time. And I think that the last point is you need a partnership full of people who are curious, who are, and we just talked about curiosity. This idea of investing, especially in tech and early stage, the world's constantly changing. And so if you're somebody who's just sort of like, oh, I know what I'm doing, I just need to find another one of those, that doesn't last the test of time. They may get lucky again. And so you have lots of weird signals in this business, but like the number of firms who have lasted the test of time is very small. And I think one of the common traits is that they have partners who are, from various psychological reasons, constantly looking for self-improvement. They're curious, they're paranoid. One of those drivers is causing them to constantly improve as investors.
That makes a lot of sense. And I remember seeing, it's not original, but like this, I remember seeing an Instagram video. Goes to show what my information diet looks like. But they were saying like, what's the difference between motivation versus discipline? And I never really kind of put them on this in the same sentence, to be completely honest. But in terms of motivation, this is for all the visual folks who are watching this on video and not listening to audio. But you'll have like a line, like a baseline, so to speak, right? And the motivation folks can like have these spurts of motivation where they go up, and then they drop below that baseline. And then it takes a while for them to motivate themselves to get up and up again, and they drop below the baseline. Versus discipline is, it'll be more consistent. You like just hop right above the baseline every single time, because you're never going to go below it, because you're like, I'm not going to do anything that goes below what my homeostatic state is. Yeah. And I find that to be a really interesting, like, I think visual representation of the best firms have this element of cultural discipline, that they continue doing the right things, because there are a lot of like, if you do one fund, there's a lot of false positives, false negatives. Yeah. But if you do multiple firms, you can then start seeing like, hey, where's the consistency? Because even if you roll a dice, like, multiple times, you're going to get each number 1/6 of the time. Well, let's assume it's not a loaded dice, right? Although in venture, some people might argue it, like we do have a loaded dice at times.
Yeah. In venture, as LPs, we're looking for GPs who have loaded dice, who have unfair advantages, for sure.
Because if it's market average, I like one of my friends, I think he'll come out with the research soon, so I don't want to call it out yet, but when this comes out, I'll link it in show notes. But he did this like research into kind of Canadians market, right? And he also looked into the NASDAQ, and he saw if you were investing into the vintages of 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, NASDAQ, right? Yeah. Where you treated it as if you were doing a fund investment, meaning if you were investing 25% of your capital per year without liquidating until year 10, what would be the multiple on that? And he saw that range between those years to be between, I want to say, like, don't quote me on this, but I am probably directionally accurate, but 2.8, 3.5 multiple.
Okay.
And if that's the MOIC, like as venture and an illiquid asset class, you have to do better.
You have a high bar. Yeah. There's a metric that I don't think many LPs actually use, but it's available, called the public market equivalent, PME. And it gives you essentially a measure of, you take all the cash flows of your fund, and then you literally model what the return would have been had you done those cash flows in and out in the public markets. And
I've heard, I'm curious on your take here, but I've heard that for venture, depending on the vintage in which you're investing in, the bar is effectively 1.5x kind of PME, because you can't just do the same as the public market, because it's like, why bother? But you have to do better. And that premium, I've heard from some folks, and feel free to disagree here, but I've heard from some folks is at least 50% better than public markets.
I have not. I've done a couple of deep dives over the last decade. I've been an LP in PME. We've not found useful for ourselves, and only once or twice has an LP of ours actually wanted to really like dig into it. Yeah. So I don't know. There very well may be far smarter LPs than me who use PME effectively. I've not seen research that is used in practice that would give a research-based number, but I can imagine an intuitive answer of you need a risk premium for the dispersion of returns in venture, and something above 1 for PMU would certainly make sense. Right? You need to be the markets. You need to be the markets by some multiple, not just by a little. Like because there's an illiquidity. There's a premium for the illiquidity that you should expect. I think most large allocators who have significant venture programs aren't tracking PMU because it's too like every vintage can be different. You'd have to measure over a long period of time. I think their main motivation actually is actually the diversification benefit. So not necessarily not just outperformance, but the lower correlation to the rest of the portfolio.
Right.
Then again, I'm conjecturing on other people's businesses.
I mean, we'll attribute a lot of this to speculation, and even that 1.5x that I was talking about. It happened in some conversations, but I don't know how research backed it is. But it sounds nice as a corollary.
It's a really cool idea for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, all three of you, for sharing your thoughts here. I've been taking copious notes myself, and I know this is going to be an episode I revisit a lot. So, not to be cognizant of time, thank you so much, and we'll see you all soon. I want to give a special shout out to today's sponsor, Alchemist Accelerator. Backed by the likes of Coastal Ventures, Mayfield, Salesforce, just to name a few, Alchemist is the top B2B startup accelerator that's been around since 2012, backing founders from day one. And if you've been around for 12 years and running laser focused only on one industry, you build this incredible set of flywheels, and positive feedback loop is absolutely insane. We back the best enterprise talent who go on to change the world in which we live in, who then come back to their hometown, coach, and mentor the next generation of world-class enterprise talent. And don't take it just from me. Alchemist has backed the likes of Launch Darkly, Rigetti, Privacera, Mo Engage, FarmWise, just to name a few, many of which who have come back as mentors and coaches for the current classes of Alchemist. If you're curious and want to get more involved in the Alchemist ecosystem, check out alchemistaccelerator.com/superclusters. That's an S at the beginning and S at the end, and we'll include the link in the show notes below. Till next, stay awesome. Hey Superclusters fans, David from Post here, and if you're tuning in from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts find your ear, it'd mean the world to me if you left a review. For those from the YouTube universe, let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments, and it'd mean a lot to me if you could share this episode with just one other person who'd get a kick out of today's topics. I'm on the road to publishing to at least 100 episodes of Superclusters, so every comment, question, review helps me make this experience more helpful, exciting, and fun for you. And lastly, I want to share a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this episode are for informational purposes only and are solely the views of myself and the guest alone. They are not representative of Alchemist Accelerator. None of the views expressed herein constitute legal, investment, business, or tax advice. Any allusions or references to funds or companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment recommendations. Consult a professional investment advisor prior to making any investment decisions. And that's all from me. See you on the next.